Hey guys, tonight we're setting up camp just outside the city walls. The air is brisk, the horses are restless, and somewhere nearby, someone's sharpening a longsword just a little too dramatically. You stand at the edge of a muddy tournament field, the kind where egos clash louder than swords. Your boots are caked with mud, your armor smells like someone else's sweat, and the fire isn't warm so much as it's just not cold. And then, there he is, a knight. No pants, just a tunic, chainmail, and legs as bare as the truth. You stare. You blink. You ask yourself the obvious question. Why would someone willingly go pantsless in a world filled with thorns, splinters, and the occasional enemy spear? Welcome to tonight's tale, one full of knights, nonsense, and noble thighs. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a cozy bed somewhere far away, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where these weird little stories wander off to. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The wind hisses through your tent flap, snapping it like a banner. You're tired, sore, and not entirely sure you brought the right leggings for this kind of climate. But the knight across the campfire doesn't seem to care. He's leaned back, legs bare from the knee down, sipping something suspicious from a wooden cup, and eyeing his opponent like he's already bored of winning. You can't stop staring. You whisper to your squire, "Why isn't he wearing pants?" The squire shrugs, as if that's a question only the gods or very old tailors could answer. Some say it's a power move. Turns out, it kind of was. In the High Middle Ages, particularly from the 11th to 13th centuries, some knights deliberately avoided wearing what we'd now call trousers, particularly in courtly settings or non-combat scenarios. Pants, known then by various names like braque, chausses, or hose, were not yet unified into the snug leg coverings we think of today. In fact, among the nobility, leg coverings were often divided. Individual cloth tubes tied to a belt, worn under a long tunic. It was complicated. But among the older or more conservative knightly class, especially those who leaned into Roman ideals of virtue and bravery, trousers were still something of an embarrassment. They smacked of barbarian culture, the kind worn by Celts, Germans, and other non-Roman folk. In fact, the great Roman historian Tacitus once mocked northern tribes for their silly leg wraps, and Rome's disdain echoed long after its fall. By not wearing pants, or at least not wearing the visible sewn kind associated with commoners, certain knights made a point. They weren't humble, they weren't modest, they weren't ashamed of skin. Modesty to them was for monks. They were warriors, born to stride into court or onto the field with pride and breeze-kissed calves. Historians still argue whether this practice was ever widespread or mostly isolated to high-ranking eccentrics, but there's no doubt that the anti-trouser sentiment had roots in both fashion and ideology. Now, let's not pretend this didn't come with consequences. One 12th century French poem described a nobleman slipping while mounting his horse because his bare thigh got caught on the saddle. A cleric watching remarked that this was clearly divine punishment for his vanity. The knight disagreed, of course, and promptly blamed his squire. And yet, for some, the discomfort was worth the image. To wear visible trousers was to align oneself with the laboring class, the types who actually did need pants because they moved more than 3 feet per hour, or, heaven forbid, bent over. Knights? They posed. They stood. They reclined in dramatic fashion, and when they did ride, they preferred long tunics with split sides, flowing capes, and the occasional breeze around the knees. The irony, of course, is that beneath their armor, even the most flamboyant knights had to wear something to prevent chafing and frostbite. But those garments were tucked away, unseen, unacknowledged, like underwear at a formal dinner. To show them off in court would have been gauche. Better to let your thighs breathe and your enemies tremble. As the fire cracks and your feet start to thaw, you notice more of them. Knights in layers of chainmail but without visible pants. The flicker of firelight on pale legs feels strange. Underdressed for battle, overdressed for bed. It's a paradox, like so much of medieval life. Appearances mattered, more than function, more than comfort, sometimes even more than survival. You try to adjust your own leggings. They itch, they pinch, and suddenly, a chill of admiration, or at least curiosity, runs down your spine. Maybe they were onto something. Still, it's getting cold. Your squire offers you a blanket. The knight across the fire just laughs, stretches out his bare legs like it's midsummer in Provence, and says, "Blankets are for squires." You're beginning to understand the mindset. Or maybe the cold is just messing with your brain. You wake to a rooster that isn't yours, and bells you don't recognize. Morning light seeps into the tent, like it's late to a meeting. Your squire fumbles with your boots while muttering about frostbite and misplaced dignity. Outside, knights are already clanking around, stretching sore limbs and brushing mud from their tunics. And yes, still, some of them are pantsless. Today, you're headed toward the training grounds. Not to fight, thankfully, but to watch a demonstration of mounted combat, more theater than danger. You shuffle along, bundled and laced, while a few swaggering nobles pass with tunics flapping breezily above their knees. It's bold, it's cold, and according to your squire, it's historically accurate. You start to wonder, how did pants even become a thing? And why were some knights so determined not to wear them? To find answers, you have to think like a fashion critic in chainmail. In the early medieval period, especially between the 5th and 10th centuries, the line between nobility and everyone else was often as visible as the clothes they wore. The lower classes wore braca, loose trousers tied at the waist, because they were practical, easy to work in, warm, useful for climbing, riding, hauling firewood, or running away from Vikings. But the upper crust? They didn't want to look like they had to do any of those things. Wearing pants signaled that you moved too much, that you bent, that you labored, that you sweat. And knights, despite fighting wars, liked to think of themselves more as symbols of spiritual virtue than sweaty mercenaries. Instead, many wore long tunics, cut to flutter just below the knees, often layered with decorative surcoats. The more fabric, the less you looked like someone who chopped wood. Here's the twist. Even when knights did wear trousers, they often made sure no one saw them. The trousers, called chausses, if they were made of mail, or hose, if of cloth, were frequently hidden beneath skirts of armor, padding, and tunics. It was almost like wearing pants, but with plausible deniability. Historians still argue whether this was purely about class signaling, or if there was some discomfort with the evolving idea of masculinity. In the early Middle Ages, the ideal man was spiritually chaste, stoic, and Romanesque in vibe. Think toga-wearing philosophers, not trouser-clad farmers. The long tunic gave off an aura of stillness, dignity, and controlled strength. pants? A bit too fidgety. Then there's the prestige factor. The further back you go, the more pants were tied to so-called uncivilized groups. The Gauls wore pants. So did the Germanic tribes. So did Persians, Scythians, and countless others, whom the Romans once saw as threats, or worse, bad fashion influencers. To some medieval minds, wearing pants was a regression, a return to barbarity. Real knights didn't need to kneel, or so they said. And if all that sounds a little ridiculous, remember, fashion often is. Modern humans wear neckties shaped like swords and think it's normal. Back then, a knight might spend a month's wages on silk thread embroidery for a tunic he'd wear over his armor, just to avoid looking too practical. On the training field, a herald blows a horn. Horses prance. A knight vaults into the saddle in one clean motion. No pants, just chainmail chausses and tunic. The crowd murmurs in admiration. Your squire squints. He waxed his legs, he mutters, possibly jealous. And while you're busy staring, a whisper from an older noble reaches your ear. You can always tell who's new by how many layers they wear. He gestures with his cup, then adds with a grin, "Real men don't flinch at a breeze." Sure. And real men probably got frostbite. The roots of this anti-trouser pride weren't just about snobbery. There was also a martial logic buried beneath the layers. Earlier warriors from the late Roman period onward favored a more robe-like aesthetic because it allowed for swift dressing and fewer seams, important when tailoring was still a dark art. Tunics were easy to dye, easy to layer, and far easier to pull off dramatically when collapsing in defeat. Besides, there were more important things to worry about, like plague or taxes. Still, the cultural stigma stuck. Even into the 12th century, writers like Orderic Vitalis and Gerald of Wales commented on how foreign leg garments looked. They weren't outright condemned, but certainly not celebrated. As late as the 13th century, chroniclers still sneered at tight hose or fancy pants as signs of vanity, idleness, or, gasp, French influence. And you? You're now officially conflicted. Your own pants are functional, warm, cleanish, but they don't shout valor. They don't flutter in the wind like a careless metaphor. You look down at your modestly covered knees and wonder, could you go pantsless? Then the wind picks up, and you remember the splinters on the tournament benches. No, probably not. But you do tip your hat to those who dared, who rode into fashion history with cold legs and hotter tempers, who defied the growing popularity of trousers in the name of tradition, glory, or just stubborn habit. Bare legs and all. You're walking now, slowly, because everything aches. Tournament viewing turns out to be more dangerous than advertised, at least for the spectators. One man got knocked unconscious by a flung gauntlet. Your squire nearly stepped on a boiling pitch pot. And you? You stubbed your toe on a tent peg and twisted something you didn't know you had. But hey, at least you're wearing pants. As you limp back to your tent, you start noticing the little things. The way knights walk differently, depending on what they've got covering their legs. Some stride confidently, long tunics swishing like curtains at a drama school. Others waddle slightly, legs wrapped tight in fabric that doesn't quite bend. And then there are the bare-legged champions, marching like their knees invented honor. And that's when it hits you. None of these people look particularly comfortable. Which brings us to the less glamorous side of knightly fashion, the chafing, the sweating, and the relentless war between fabric and flesh. Because here's the hard truth. Chainmail and skin do not get along. Picture it. You're wearing a padded linen tunic under your armor, a gambeson. thick enough to absorb a decent punch, but thin enough to let every breeze bypass it completely. Then come the chausses. Male leggings, either split or full leg, suspended by leather straps or tied to your belt. Now imagine all of that, without pants underneath. Historians still argue whether knights wore anything at all under their chausses or simply suffered in silence. Some suggest soft linen underlayers, while others believe a type of breeches or brays were tied on, mostly for modesty, or what passed for it back then. But written records are vague. Illustrations are worse. And nobody had the decency to write a memoir called My Life Beneath the Armor. Regardless, going pantsless under armor was a gamble. Yes, it reduced layers and made movement easier, at least for the first hour. But after a full day in saddle and sun, your thighs were crying, iron rubbed, fabric stuck, and by evening, your legs smelled like betrayal. One 13th century knight reportedly collapsed from heat exhaustion, and his squire confessed that he'd worn no linens at all, thinking it would make him look tougher. Instead, it made him faint halfway through a joust and spend the night rubbing goose fat on his inner thighs. That story, at least, comes from a monk's letter. We may never know if the goose fat worked. Then there's the issue of hygiene. Pants, as simple as they sound, were easier to clean than a full male chausses. A pair of woolen hose could be washed, dried, and reused. Metal, not so much. If you wore nothing beneath the armor, sweat and grime built up fast, and cleaning mail was no easy task. It involved vinegar, sand, prayer, and a truly annoying amount of shaking. But despite all this, for some, less really was more. Wearing nothing but a tunic and your armor was a deliberate show of hardened masculinity. You weren't soft. You didn't need layers. You could take it. It's worth noting, though, that fashion and functionality rarely agreed. While some knights clung to tradition, or the illusion of it, others began experimenting with newer, more fitted leg coverings. By the mid-13th century, hose became tighter, sometimes joined at the top. Padding improved. So did the understanding of airflow. But there was still a long-standing belief that real knights, real men, just dealt with discomfort. Complaining was for scribes and archers. And so, the myth of the pantsless knight persisted. The irony, of course, is that in colder regions, like the Highlands or the Baltic, knights had to wear something on their legs, or risk frostbite in places that should never turn purple. There are even records of knights layering fur under their mail during winter campaigns, creating what can only be described as medieval thermal leggings. So yes, even the bravest still had their limits. Back at your camp, your squire is sitting by the fire, whittling something that looks like a miniature chicken. He looks up. You see that guy fall during the tilt? You nod. Wasn't wearing pants. Of course he wasn't. You ease down beside him, wincing as the armor pinches. A bit of heat, a bit of rest, and then a thought creeps in. What if the no pants thing was also about speed? Fewer layers meant faster dressing. Less fabric meant quicker relief after battle. Maybe some of it was just logistics. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a statement. A weird, cold, chafing statement that said, I don't need comfort. I need honor. You sip your soup. It tastes like boiled shoe. You pull your cloak tighter and look across the fire at another knight, lounging on a bedroll, bare legs catching firelight. He nods at you. You nod back. In a strange way, you respect it now. Not the discomfort, not the smell, but the confidence. The kind of confidence only a knight with absolutely nothing between him and chainmail can summon. Still, You're keeping your pants on. The next morning, your legs are stiff, not sore, medieval sore. The kind of sore where even sitting down feels like an act of diplomacy between your knees and the bench. You step outside into a chilly fog, brushing crumbs off your tunic, and spot yet another knight prancing about with bare calves like it's a summer holiday in Naples. You rub your eyes. Maybe it's a dream. But no. The breeze confirms it. And then, suddenly, you remember something. The Romans didn't wear pants either. It starts to make sense now in that foggy medieval logic kind of way. Knights didn't just wake up one day and decide trousers were for the weak. This whole anti-pants ideology had roots, very old roots. So as you shuffle toward the morning bread line, let's go back, way back, to the Romans and their fashion legacy. Roman aristocrats, soldiers, emperors, they were all famously team no pants. The toga was their go-to garment. Tunics were common too, but the idea of covering your legs like some kind of Germanic barbarian? Scandalous. Pants, or braque, were seen as a crude necessity for uncivilized people from the north, those who lived in cold climates and needed protection from the elements. So when Rome stretched its empire across Europe, it also imposed its fashion sensibilities. And after Rome fell, the echo of its taste lingered. Long after the legions disappeared, the idea that real men don't wear trousers still clung to the elite like an old wine stain on silk. Historians still argue whether this was an intentional ideological inheritance or simply a case of elite style mimicking older traditions. But the influence is hard to miss. Medieval aristocrats often saw themselves as spiritual heirs to Roman dignity, especially during the Carolingian Renaissance, when scholars and kings alike tried to revive Latin ideals. And that included fashion. Wearing long tunics wasn't just about comfort, it was about status, nostalgia, and a subtle, "I am not like the others" message. To some medieval minds, trousers were still the domain of laborers, horsemen, or, worse yet, merchants. And you can't help but chuckle at the contradiction. These same knights who marched into muddy war zones, who slept in armor and bathed maybe twice a year, still held to the idea that pants were the real sign of a peasant. One 11th century bishop even wrote a letter of complaint about a group of young noblemen who had taken to wearing tight trousers like the Franks, calling it both indecent and excessively worldly. That's right. Some people were out here getting fashion policed for wearing pants. You reach the bread stall. It's stale, of course. Everything is. You gnaw thoughtfully, imagining yourself back in ancient Rome, where at least people had decent bathhouses. Your tunic flaps in the breeze. It's modest, safe, practical. Pants, by contrast, are apparently a gateway to sin. That belief wasn't just fashion snobbery, it had religious tones too. Early Christian monks, particularly in the West, often clung to Roman ideals of dress. To them, pants were symbolic of paganism, immodesty, or worse, vanity. That association lasted longer than you'd think. But while nobles clung to flowing robes and tunics as marks of superiority, real life had other plans. As warfare evolved, especially mounted combat, pants crept back in, slowly, quietly, like a shy peasant sneaking into a noble feast. Still, for the traditionalists, baring legs beneath armor remained a kind of throwback virtue, a connection to Rome, a statement of aloof elegance, a passive-aggressive flex that said, "I'm so noble I don't need pants to look brave." Meanwhile, across the bread line, a knight leans down to adjust his spurs. No trousers, just bare skin, goosebumps, and the confidence of someone who clearly doesn't care about splinters. Isn't he cold? You ask your squire? Probably, he replies, but you're the one shivering. Touché. As you wander away, bread in hand, you reflect on the slow, confusing journey from tunic to trousers. Roman men wore togas to avoid the label of barbarism. Medieval knights wore tunics for the same reason. Only the label had changed. What once was practical became vulgar. What once was luxurious became silly. And pants stayed stuck in the middle, awkward, functional, and forever accused of ruining a good silhouette. And yet, deep down, you kind of admire it. The dedication to looking a little ridiculous in the name of tradition. The willingness to shiver rather than give in to leg-wrapping fashion. It's silly. It's stubborn. It's very human. The wind picks up again. A sudden chill up your tunic reminds you that Roman or not, winter is undefeated. You sigh. Maybe the Romans had aqueducts, roads, and philosophy. But they definitely didn't have to sit on cold stone benches after breakfast. By the afternoon, you're sitting on a low stone wall, nursing a chipped mug of something warm and questionably alcoholic. The training ground smells like wet leather and ambition. Across the field, a small crowd gathers to watch a squire attempt to saddle a particularly uncooperative horse. He fails, twice, and earns a gentle pat on the head from his amused knight, who, naturally, is not wearing pants. You shake your head. At this point, it's almost impressive. But it's not just a battlefield or a fashion issue anymore. You're starting to notice something else. How people react to trousered legs, or more accurately, how they mock them. You wander toward the edge of the court and find yourself within earshot of a bard spinning a tale. He's theatrical, loud, clearly used to crowds. And tonight, his story includes a jab at a dull-eyed noble with legs wrapped like a fishmonger, which gets a hearty laugh. The insult lands, not because of what the noble did, but because of what he wore. Trousers. Again. Here's the thing. In high medieval court culture, clothing wasn't just status, it was personality. Your outfit said whether you were devout, romantic, brave, vain, or hopelessly nouveau riche. And pants? Pants were for either the extremely fashionable or the socially doomed. While some knights used their tunics to evoke old Roman dignity, others actively scorned pants as a foreign import. Brockie and early hose, though practical, were seen in many circles as signs of Eastern or barbarian influence. They were worn by Persians, by Moors, by steppe horsemen and Saracens, those other knights whose skill was admired but whose style was suspect. And so, a strange paradox emerged. Pants were both deeply practical and wildly controversial. Historians still debate the degree to which noble courts discouraged trousers, but written texts and illustrations from the 11th and 12th centuries suggest that while lower-class men and soldiers regularly wore brocade or hose, aristocrats only embraced them in secret or mocked them in public. Court poets in southern France often reserved their sharpest barbs for knights dressed like dancers. And in some German courts, jesters wore exaggerated trousers as part of their comic identity. Big, puffed-out monstrosities that drew attention to their legs and, by association, their foolishness. In other words, pants were literally the punchline. One famous manuscript illustration shows a knight being blessed by a monk while clearly wearing tightly laced hose, accompanied by a tiny scroll with the words, "Even saints wore shame on their knees." Whether it was satire or scribal humor, the meaning was clear. Wear pants and prepare for ridicule. And yet there were exceptions. more cosmopolitan courts, particularly those influenced by Eastern fashion, like Norman Sicily or Al-Andalus, pants had a different reputation. Silk trousers, wide-legged and heavily embroidered, were prized imports. Some aristocrats even wore them under long coats or robes, flaunting the rich fabric at the ankle like a status symbol. But again, only a peak. To show off the full garment was considered either vain or foreign, and in some places, it wasn't just frowned upon, it was banned. A few high-born women's diaries mention how, during formal events, knights and noblemen were requested to wear appropriate court dress, meaning tunics, cloaks, and no tight hose on display. One woman even wrote, "It is hard to take a man seriously when you can count his knees from across the room." You sip your drink. That sounds fair. Still, as you glance around the courtyard, it's obvious that times are slowly shifting. Younger knights, less tied to old Roman ideals, seem more comfortable with mixed styles. You spot one lad in modest woolen hose under a tunic slit high for riding. It's functional, respectful, and only slightly drafty. A compromise. But for now, the old rules still linger. Trousers remain caught in a strange medieval limbo, simultaneously smart and silly, useful and shameful. And some nights, they lean into the rebellion. Refusing pants becomes its own kind of statement, a stubborn declaration that they decide what knighthood looks like, not fashion or foreign courts. You rise, mug empty, and stretch your legs. Comfortably clothed, thankfully. A nearby knight sees you adjusting your hose and chuckles. "Careful," he says. "You'll give people ideas." You grin. "About dignity?" "No," he replies. "About tailoring." Touché, again. The next day, you're pulled from your bedroll by a trumpet blast and the low, disgruntled mutter of your squire. "We're marching," he says, because apparently someone wants to die cold. You groan, buckle your belt, and curse whoever decided medieval mornings should start before the sun. Within an hour, you're part of a slow-moving column of knights, squires, cooks, and absolutely no one in a hurry. The weather is doing that uniquely medieval thing, where it's both freezing and slightly damp. You shift in your saddle and try not to think about your legs, which, thankfully, are clothed. Not everyone is so lucky. To your left, a hardened veteran rides proudly without trousers, his chainmail chausses swinging freely from his belt, offering zero insulation and even less modesty. He's wrapped in a fur cloak, sure, but beneath it, nothing but tunic, armor, and confidence. Doesn't he feel it? You mutter. Your squire shrugs. He says it makes him faster. Faster at what? Freezing? Which brings us to one of the most debated and illogically romantic parts of medieval life, the battlefield. Because yes, even in battle, some knights went without pants. It wasn't universal. It wasn't constant, but it happened. Especially in warmer climates or during sudden conflicts, when knights might ride out without full kit, choosing speed and maneuverability over the hassle of tugging on multiple layers. Historians still argue whether this was ever considered acceptable military practice or just a last-minute fashion emergency. Some chronicles describe knights wearing only tunics and chausses, often over bare skin. Others note full leg armor, worn with brays underneath for comfort. But there are gaps. Artistic depictions are ambiguous, and most first-hand accounts were written by monks who thought even talking about legs was borderline sinful. But practicality does whisper some logic here. Medieval armor was heavy, sometimes 40 to 60 pounds in total. Adding too many layers underneath could restrict movement, especially in the legs. Knights had to mount horses, dodge arrows, swing swords, and occasionally fall off things dramatically. The fewer layers, the more freedom, at least in theory. Then there's the reality: saddle sores, leather straps, chainmail pinch points. If you've ever ridden a horse for more than 5 minutes in jeans, you already know how bad it can get. Now imagine that, but medieval, with no antibiotics, and someone trying to hit you with a mace. Some knights simply preferred to go minimal. One 12th century knight in southern Italy reportedly wore only a padded gambeson, helmet, and mail chausses to battle, refusing trousers entirely. His reasoning? The Lord gave me legs strong enough for steel, and shame weakens no man. Of course, he also died of an infected groin wound 3 weeks later, but that part didn't make it into the bard's version. Back in the saddle, your own thighs are starting to protest. The damp is sinking through your hose like it has a vendetta. You shift awkwardly, watching bare-legged warriors ride ahead with an ease that's both admirable and concerning. And then, as if summoned, rain. Not a downpour, just that annoying sideways mist that soaks everything slowly and ruins morale. Your tunic sticks to your back, your chausses cling to your calves, and the knights without pants? Smiling. Why? Because they don't have fabric to soak through. Their legs dry faster. No clammy wool clinging to them like a sad dog. One knight even rides by, arms spread, face tilted to the sky like he's starring in a play called Dignity is for the Dry. You hate how smug he looks. And yet you can't deny the unexpected truth. In some ways, going pantsless in battle wasn't entirely foolish. It had risks, many risks. But it also had advantages: less fabric to snag, fewer seams to tear, a faster transition from sleeping to riding, and above all, fewer laundry problems. Of course, it also made you more vulnerable to everything: splinters, frostbite, and weapons with names like Man-Catcher. Armor wasn't foolproof, and chainmail didn't always cover everything. But the point was rarely protection alone. It was the image. A knight without trousers projected courage, stoicism, and a profound disregard for wind chill. By midday, you've stopped for rest beneath a pine tree. You rub your knees and try to discreetly adjust your hose, which are now forming a small swamp at your shins. A nearby knight watches, amused. "Should have gone bare," he says, grinning. "And risked my reputation?" you reply. He shrugs. Reputation's just a story people tell. Frostbite, that's forever. Valid point. Still, as you stare out at the gray horizon, watching knights snack on cheese and argue over which saint protects against saddle rash, you can't help but marvel at the medieval logic. Pants were an option, not a rule. An accessory, something to weigh against speed, status, and personal tolerance for cold iron. It's ridiculous. It's inconvenient. It's so very, very human. And somehow it works. You wake up stiff. Not just slept on a bad pillow stiff, wooden plank with a dent in it and someone snoring on your ankle. Stiff. Your joints creak like cathedral doors, your knees audibly regret being knees, and your lower back has apparently filed a grievance with the gods. And today, you're headed to a monastery. For penance. Not yours, thankfully. You're just accompanying a knight who, after yesterday's leg-bearing performance and some casual blasphemy involving a roast pig and a hymn, was advised to seek spiritual cooling. Translation: go apologize to the monks. It's a quiet ride. Fields blur past, bees buzz lazily around the thorn bushes, and your knight companion, still defiantly pantsless, hums an off-key ballad about St. George that involves more dragons than theology. you sigh and resign yourself to the thought that some people are just born barefoot in spirit. When you reach the monastery, the contrast is immediate. Silence reigns. The walls are plain, the windows tiny, the doors stern and wooden. You dismount, brush the dust from your cloak, and immediately become hyper-aware that you're surrounded by men who've taken vows of poverty, chastity, and, judging by their expressions, modesty. Your knight, however, is unbothered. Tunic to the thigh, chainmail glinting just above the knee, he struts toward the chapel like it's Fashion Week in Florence. Which brings us to a fascinating tension in the medieval world. Christian ideals about the body, and how bare legs fit into that theology. Because, as it turns out, knights didn't just have to worry about swords and social ridicule. They also had to navigate an increasingly vocal church that wasn't thrilled about the growing trend of visible thighs. You see, early Christianity had a complicated relationship with flesh. On the one hand, the body was seen as a divine creation, something to be respected, cared for, and modestly veiled. On the other hand, it was also a source of temptation, and therefore something to restrain, cover, or outright ignore whenever possible. So when a knight sauntered into a holy place with knees exposed like declarations of rebellion, it created tension. Not just visual discomfort, but spiritual unease. Monks and clerics wrote letters, sermons, even entire treatises on the decline of virtue in fashion. And yes, pants, or the lack thereof, were often right at the center of it. Historians still argue whether these condemnations were truly aimed at bare legs or just part of a larger frustration with increasing vanity and courtly excess. But the records are clear. Multiple bishops and abbots scolded knights for tight hose, short tunics, or naked knees beneath the cross. Some monasteries even kept spare cloaks on hand, just in case a visitor needed covering. Which sounds generous until you realize they were essentially fashion emergency kits for improperly dressed nobles. One particularly grumpy abbot in Burgundy reportedly stopped an entire procession when a knight arrived wearing hose tight as sin and proceeded to kneel during prayer, causing what the scribe described as a stirring of eyes and impure thoughts. And yet, some religious communities tolerated it, even embraced it, especially among certain penitential orders, where self-mortification and bodily discomfort were encouraged. If a knight wanted to show devotion by wearing only rough wool or going without breeches as a form of penance, that was fine, admirable even. There are records of flagellants, hermits, and wandering holy men who deliberately exposed themselves to the elements, legs included, as a way to reject vanity and embrace suffering. Which, ironically, isn't that far off from what some pantsless knights claimed they were doing. Rejecting comfort to prove their toughness. The overlap between martyr and macho was thinner than most tunics. Back in the monastery, your knight kneels before the altar, no cloak offered. The monks do their best to ignore the situation. You, meanwhile, are trying not to laugh. The absurdity of it all, the reverence, the chanting, and your companion's visible calf muscles flexing with every humble breath. And yet, somehow, it fits. Because this was medieval life. Contradictory, messy, holy one moment, absurd the next. A world where a man could go from battlefield to chapel without ever adjusting his hemline and still be taken seriously, provided he bowed low enough and gave a proper donation. You light a candle and reflect, on knees, on penance, on how a simple piece of fabric, or the choice to skip it, could spark theological debates, artistic ridicule, and actual fashion bans. And still, despite all this, people kept not wearing pants. You rise. The night exits, forgiven but unrepentant, whistling through the courtyard. A monk offers you a loaf of bread and a brief, exhausted sigh, as if to say, "We tried." You nod and tuck the bread into your satchel. Another day, another pair of legs, bare, proud, and utterly immune to shame. You're back on the road again, this time headed toward a village fair. The kind with more mud than market stalls, more noise than music, and the unmistakable smell of livestock blended with roasted onions. You breathe it in like someone trying to convince themselves that this is fun. Around you, knights mingle with merchants, barons with beggars, and somewhere, there's a juggler who hasn't dropped anything yet. A miracle, really. But what catches your eye isn't the lute players or the fire eater or even the cheese wheel on stilts. It's the locals, the peasants, the common folk, every one of them sensibly dressed in trousers, hose, or breeches, pants, and more pants, not a bare leg in sight. You feel like you've stepped into a parallel dimension, a place where knees are no longer symbols of valiant defiance, but just joints, where pants are normal, expected, and gasp, respected, and it gets you thinking. What did pants mean for the lower classes in the medieval world? Unlike their noble counterparts, medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of making anti-pants fashion statements. They had work to do, fields to till, buckets to carry, cows to wrangle. Try doing any of that with your thighs flapping in the wind. So trousers, practical, loose-fitting, bracky, or tied brays, were common across rural Europe, usually made of wool or linen, belted at the waist, and sometimes worn with knee-high leg wraps called puttees. They were the logical uniform of the overworked. Historians still argue whether peasant trousers varied significantly by region or were relatively uniform, but one thing's certain, they weren't optional. Cold winters, thorny fields, insect bites. These were daily hazards that knights didn't worry about from atop their horses. Yet even among peasants, there was fashion, of a sort. Older men wore wider pants. Young men liked tighter hose. Some dyed their fabric with onion skin or walnut to show off a touch of color. But for the most part, clothing was about survival, not statements. And still, they noticed. When knights showed up to a village in tunics and bare legs, it turned heads, sometimes with admiration, sometimes confusion, sometimes suppressed laughter. In one English manor roll from the late 13th century, a local reeve wrote that a visiting knight, dressed like a windswept child, though grown and armored, caused such a scene that 2 chickens escaped and a baker dropped an entire tray of pies. Exaggeration? Probably. Hilarious? Absolutely. The divide wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. The pantsless knight was a guest from another world, a walking embodiment of status, vanity, and absurdity. And while peasants wouldn't dare insult a noble to his face, jokes traveled quickly. In alehouses and kitchens, songs were sung, some still surviving in scraps of rude verse. One popular line, "He rides like a lord, bare-kneed and proud, but I've never seen courage in thunder that loud." Back at the fair, you buy a meat pie. It's questionable. Everything about it screams, "last week's mutton." But it's warm, and your stomach has entered the bargaining stage of hunger. You find a bench, sit beside a farmer chewing on straw, and strike up a casual conversation. His accent is thick, his story's thicker. You mention knights. He grins. "Knights? he says. "I seen one just last week. Came by with legs like a roast goose. Thought he was cursed." Cursed? Or daft? Maybe both. You both laugh. It's easy, simple, grounded. Because to the peasantry, the whole no pants thing wasn't romantic. It was weird, maybe even a bit dangerous. A man who dressed like he didn't expect to work was either important or insane, sometimes both, but certainly not someone to imitate. And yet, now and then, a local lad might shorten his tunic just to see what it felt like, just to try on the swagger, to pretend, briefly, that he was born into silk instead of soil. You glance around the fair. A few children play sword fight with sticks. One of them is wearing his father's oversized tunic and no pants. He yells, "For glory," and immediately slips in the mud. Fashion is fickle like that. The fair winds down as the sun dips lower. You gather your things and prepare to ride back to camp. As you pass the juggler, still drop-free against all odds, you can't help but admire the villagers. No armor, no squires, no status, but sensible shoes and covered legs. They're not fighting for chivalry or honor, just warmth, food, and maybe a good story to laugh at later. And somehow, that feels just as noble. The sun is setting by the time you return to camp, painting the sky in medieval shades of orange and inconvenience. Your horse is tired, your stomach is grumbling again, despite that regrettable pie, and your legs? They're finally warm, which is why you nearly weep when you see the knight from earlier, the one who swore by the bare leg lifestyle standing by the fire, drying his soaked tunic. You blink. He's not just damp, he's defeated. His calves are red, his knees scraped, and his expression is that of a man who has deeply reconsidered his fashion choices. Apparently, pants have entered the chat. You sit near the flames and stretch your legs out toward the heat. Across the camp, a few squires are hanging gear, oiling mail, and gossiping like old women at a baptism. One of them says, "Did you hear about Sir Reynold? Took a splinter to the thigh, right through the mail." Someone gasps, "Was he not wearing hose?" "Nope," said they restricted his spirit. Well, his spirit's now infected. Laughter, crude, unkind, but laced with truth. Which brings us to another unavoidable topic: the physical risks of going pantsless in armor. It's easy to romanticize the image of a bold knight charging into battle in flowing garments and shining metal. Less easy to romanticize the medical fallout when that same knight's legs rub raw against rusting mail or get stabbed by a wayward branch. Historians still argue whether most knights wore sufficient padding beneath their mail chausses. Some documents suggest layers of linen or quilted wool were standard for those who could afford them. Others imply that many young squires and low-ranking knights skipped those layers, either out of haste, cost, or sheer machismo. One 14th century medical text from Paris includes a full section on common abrasions of the thigh in mounted men, which, when translated generously, is a polite way of saying chafing was a national crisis. And it wasn't just blisters or splinters. Without protective leg wear, knights were vulnerable to paralysis, infection, and slow-healing wounds, especially in an era when bandages were made of moss and medicine came in two flavors, wine or screaming. The most infamous case? A northern French knight named Gervais, who went bare-legged into battle to intimidate the Flemish with his noble blood. Instead, he fell off his horse, landed in a thorn bush, and spent the rest of his short life being nicknamed Sir Pricklebutt. That last part may be apocryphal, but the chronicles are unanimous. He died. Eventually, painfully. Back at the fire, a young knight asks you if you've ever gone without trousers beneath armor. You laugh. Once. In July. And? Felt like I was riding on a skillet. He nods solemnly. That's the most honest thing I've heard all week. You sip some broth and reflect. As armor advanced, from mail to plate, so did the padding. By the 14th century, full suits of articulated plate armor required careful layering beneath, including padded hose, arming doublets, and linen drawers. Going commando under that much steel wasn't just uncomfortable, it was logistically impossible. You'd be one step from medieval origami. But even then, the old habits lingered. Older knights still grumbled about how young lads need too many buckles, and some diehards would occasionally strip down to minimal gear just to prove they still could, and occasionally regret it deeply. Because here's the secret truth. Even the bravest knights didn't enjoy pain. They endured it. They wore it like a badge. But they also had limits. And somewhere between the tournament field and the muddy campaign trail, even the most stubborn of bare-legged warriors began to accept what peasants and monks had known all along. Pants, however unglamorous, were practical. The fire crackles. Someone tells a joke about a knight who mistook a wasp nest for a helmet. You stretch, yawn, and glance again at the formerly pantsless knight now wearing someone else's hose. He catches your eye and shrugs. Turns out frostbite doesn't look noble. No, you reply, but it does look permanent. You both chuckle and stare into the flames. Sometimes wisdom arrives wrapped in bandages. You wake up to fog, thick, clinging, and cold enough to make you question every life decision that led to a bedroll and a dented helmet. Your breath comes out in little clouds, and somewhere nearby, someone is loudly regretting last night's stew. Medieval mornings are rarely poetic. But today, something feels different. There's a shift in the air, a kind of nervous energy. As you trudge toward the training yard, you find out why. Inspection. A royal herald has arrived, complete with polished boots, absurdly white gloves, and the world's most judgmental mustache. He's here to observe the troops, which mostly involves squinting at people's tunics and making passive-aggressive comments about armor polish. And wouldn't you know it, he hates bare legs. You watch as one unfortunate knight is pulled aside for inappropriate battle attire, which the herald describes as unbefitting the dignity of the realm. The knight, clearly proud of his breezy chainmail aesthetic, tries to argue that his style honors the traditions of old. The herald sniffs. It dishonors the tradition of trousers, which, oddly enough, leads us to the role of fashion codes, sumptuary laws, and noble appearances in the ongoing war between pants and pride. Because while knights like to imagine they could wear whatever they pleased, by the later Middle Ages, that just wasn't true anymore. As kingdoms centralized and courts became more elaborate, rulers began to crack down on dress, especially among the nobility. Sumptuary laws were passed in various regions, England, France, the Italian city-states, all aiming to control who could wear what and how much of it. These laws weren't just about fashion, they were about status signaling, economic control, and the quiet panic of elites trying to distinguish themselves from up-and-coming merchants. If a wealthy tanner could afford silk hose, then what did that say about your embroidered knightly tunic? Historians still argue whether these laws were strictly enforced or mostly symbolic, but their intent was clear. Dress mattered. And yes, pants were included. In some places, tight hose were considered immodest unless paired with a proper tunic of sufficient length. In others, short tunics were banned outright for men of certain classes. And among the elite, particularly at royal courts, trousers were scrutinized for tightness, fabric, and even color. One 15th century French ordinance famously warned against the indecent display of the male form beneath hose too tightly stitched, which is a very polite way of saying, stop showing your butt at court. You stand straighter as the herald approaches. Your tunic, passable. Your chausses, dusty but covered. Your expression, deeply apologetic by default. He sniffs, adjusts his gloves, and nods. You've passed. For now. A squire nearby isn't so lucky. His hose are mismatched, one red, one brown. The herald stares at him like he's just declared war on color theory. But beyond the rules and the snobbery, there's something else happening here. Something deeper. The age of the ideal knight is beginning to change. No longer just warriors. Knights are expected to be courtiers, dancers, poets, and diplomats. They must know how to fight, yes, but also how to dress, dine, and deliver compliments in verse. And you can't exactly do that with your knees out. So, as the chivalric code tightens its grip, pants become less about practicality and more about respectability. A knight with trousers is someone ready to appear before the king. A knight without them? A reminder of rougher, older times, when blood and mud and chainmail were the uniform, not manners and brocade. You watch as more knights are checked, corrected, and in some cases sent back to camp for appropriate redressing. There's a certain comedy to it. Grown men being scolded like fashionably reckless schoolboys. And yet, it's a turning point. This moment, this inspection, marks a shift in the knightly image. From wild warrior to refined noble. From iron-wrapped barbarian to silk-sleeved servant of the court. And with that transformation comes a farewell to bare thighs. Mostly. Because of course some knights won't let go. You spot one across the yard now, arms crossed, tunic just slightly too short, legs defiantly breezy. The herald glares. The knight raises an eyebrow. It's a silent duel. But even as he stands firm, you sense it. The tide is turning. The age of tunic-only gallantry is fading. The future, tailored, fitted, trousered. You look down at your own legs and give your woolen hose a gentle, appreciative pat. You never thought you'd say this, but thank goodness for pants. The herald is gone now, having left a trail of wounded egos and deeply self-conscious squires in his wake. You, mercifully, survived the inspection with only a passive-aggressive comment about rustic elegance. It could have been worse. The camp settles back into its rhythm. Boots being repaired, shields being restrapped, and somewhere in the distance, someone loudly failing to play a recorder. You wander toward the armory, your mind drifting, not to weapons or heraldry, but to something more personal, something you've started noticing during your time among the knights. Not all bare legs belong to men. Yes, today we finally address something rarely discussed and frequently misunderstood: the role of women in knightly garb, and the curious cases where they too refused pants. It begins, as these things often do, with a scandal. You remember the story well, told in hushed tones and loud taverns alike. A noblewoman in Burgundy, high-born and high-spirited, who took to wearing her brother's riding gear while he was away on campaign. Tunic, boots, mail, even his hose. But soon, she stopped bothering with the hose altogether. She said it was too hot, too heavy, and too obviously built for someone else's legs. Naturally, this was considered unladylike. The local bishop called it an affront to natural order, while local women called it interesting. She rode, she hunted, she trained with a blade, and no one quite knew what to do with her. But she wasn't alone. In various corners of Europe, there are scattered records, half-ignored footnotes really, of women adopting parts of the knightly life. Sometimes in disguise, sometimes openly, sometimes as nobles, sometimes as mercenaries, servants, or camp followers who refused to be confined to dresses while sloshing through mud behind an army. Historians still debate whether these women were exceptions or just the tip of an undocumented reality. One chronicler in northern Italy noted a lady of rare strength who rode and fought as well as any man, and often without breeches, for she found them cumbersome. Another described a woman in Bohemia who wore a long tunic with mail underneath, legs bare in summer, wool wrapped in winter, fighting alongside her brothers in skirmishes against raiders. And yet, these women weren't always rebels. Sometimes they were simply practical. You see, the issue wasn't just trousers, it was what trousers meant. In most of Europe, breeches were considered male garments. Wearing them, especially openly, invited accusations of impropriety, gender confusion, or even heresy. In fact, sumptuary laws in some cities specifically forbade women from wearing hose or pants, save in cases of extreme weather or theatrical performance, which, naturally, left quite a bit of room for interpretation. Still, when a woman showed up with exposed legs, whether bare, wrapped, or armored, it caused a stir. The crowd didn't always disapprove, but they definitely stared. And some women, bold as banners, used that attention. There's the tale of Lady Isabeau, a minor noble in Flanders, who would ride into festivals dressed in full page attire, short tunic, high boots, legs scandalously on display. She claimed it was an homage to Mars. The bishop called it a corruption of Venus, but everyone else called it memorable. Back at the armory, you chat with the blacksmith's apprentice, a wiry girl with strong hands and soot-streaked cheeks. She's rolling her eyes at a knight who refuses to wear greaves because they pinch. Men, she mutters. Too proud to wear trousers, too weak to wear steel. You grin. Have you ever worn mail? She shrugs. Sometimes, better than skirts in a forge. You glance at her legs, wrapped in sturdy wool, belted at the knee. Not exactly armor, but definitely not a gown either. She doesn't flinch under your gaze. And in that moment, you realize something. The war on pants wasn't just about comfort, or vanity, or battle readiness. It was also about identity. About who got to choose what they wore, and why. Some knights refused trousers to cling to an ancient image of heroism. Some peasants wore them because survival demanded it, and some women wore, or didn't wear, whatever they pleased, because the rules weren't written for them anyway. You leave the armory in thoughtful silence. Outside, the sun is setting again, the clouds painted in slow gold. You pass a group of younger squires wrestling over a loaf of bread, half-dressed and entirely free of shame. One of them waves, pants half pulled, laughing like it's the best day of his life. And maybe it is. You think of Lady Isabeau, of the blacksmith's apprentice, of every soul in history who wore, or didn't wear, what they needed to feel strong, or safe, or simply like themselves. Turns out, The battle for bare legs had more warriors than anyone knew. It's nearly dusk when a trumpeter starts playing something that was probably meant to be a fanfare, but now sounds suspiciously like a goose being strangled. You step out of your tent, still chewing a roasted onion, and see the source of the excitement. A royal envoy has arrived, silk robes, 2 nervous horses, and a scroll longer than a winter sermon. Tonight, apparently, there will be a banquet. You sigh. Banquets mean speeches. Speeches mean nobles. And nobles, of course, mean fashion. Lots of it. Carefully curated, embroidered, perfumed, and usually involving more layers than weather should allow. So naturally, you begin mentally preparing to see what is arguably the most puzzling nightly contradiction of all. Men who refuse to wear pants in formal settings. Because somehow, despite centuries of war, church lectures, and cold breezes, there remained a certain breed of knight who insisted that the highest honor was to show up to courtly events exactly as one would show up to war, pantless and proud. And tonight, you're about to be surrounded by them. The hall is packed. Candles flicker on stone walls. A pig is turning on a spit. Musicians attempt to harmonize over the clatter of trenchers and the murmurs of politics. You take your seat next to a minor baron who smells faintly of onions and something more existential. And then they enter. A trio of knights, cloaks flowing, tunics glittering, absolutely no hose in sight. Their thighs gleam under the torchlight like a sermon against modesty. They strut. That's the only word for it. They strut across the room like peacocks who've never heard of chafing. One of them nods toward a duchess. She blushes. Or maybe that's embarrassment on his behalf. It's hard to say. You chew your onion thoughtfully. Because here's the twist. In certain circles, going without trousers wasn't just accepted. It was celebrated. In highly romanticized court cultures, especially during the height of chivalric literature, knights were expected to look like walking poems. Long limbs, flowing tunics, hair that shimmered like hope itself, and nothing ruined a perfectly tragic silhouette like a pair of wrinkled breeches. Historians still argue whether this pantsless chic was ever widespread or mostly confined to poetic exaggeration. But illuminated manuscripts from the late 13th and early 14th centuries do show knights at feasts and dances with conspicuously bare legs, though modesty is usually preserved by artful poses or oddly long tablecloths. In one famous poem from Aquitaine, a lady swoons not at a knight's swordplay, but at his untroubled knees, brave as any lion. You're not sure how brave a knee can be, but it's clear someone found them inspiring. Still, even at court, the no-pants look had its critics. Older lords grumbled that these new, courtly knights cared more about looking dashing than upholding real martial values. Some clerics dubbed them lily-thighed, suggesting softness, vanity, or a dangerous preference for style over steel. And at least one Italian philosopher compared bare-legged knights to glazed pastries, pleasing to the eye, but hollow inside. You can't help but chuckle at that one. And yet, they had influence. Young nobles copied them. Tailors adjusted tunics accordingly. Paintings immortalized their fashion. For a time, to be seen in court with nothing but a tunic and confidence was not a sign of poverty, but of rank, a risky sort of elegance. Of course, this trend could only thrive in specific conditions: wealth, indoor temperatures, and complete social immunity. Try the same thing at a rainy tournament, and you'd earn mockery, frostbite, or both. Back at the banquet, the first course is served: boar with apple. A bard begins singing something vaguely rhyming, and across the room, the bare-legged trio begins comparing sword lengths. Figuratively, of course. At least you hope it's figuratively. You sip your mead. There's something admirable in their conviction. You might not agree with it, or wear it, or fully understand it, but there's a certain defiant joy in their knee-forward rebellion. A refusal to let trousers ruin the drama of the nightly mystique. Still, as you feel a draft roll beneath the table, you mutter a quiet prayer of thanks for your thick woolen hose. Practicality may never be poetic, but it is warm. The evening winds down, platters empty. Laughter rises. One of the pantless wonders recites a sonnet about the moon. The Duchess giggles. The Baron beside you is asleep in his wine. And as you make your way back to your tent under a starlit sky, you reflect. In a world where appearances could win wars, or at least dinner invitations, sometimes the most powerful statement a knight could make was not what he wore, but what he didn't. Morning arrives with a headache. Not yours, thankfully, but the knight 2 tents over who spent the night reciting poetry into a flagon. You pass him groaning in the grass, tunic askew, no pants in sight. His squire is trying to cover him with a saddle blanket and whatever dignity remains. You're headed to the stables today. Nothing glamorous, just another day on the road. Checking gear, retightening saddles, trying not to step in anything that once had hooves. But even in the muck, the great medieval paradox persists. Some knights have armored boots, reinforced greaves, and quilted hose, and others, bare knees and bravado. At this point, you've learned to stop questioning it. Mostly. Because today, you're more interested in a different kind of knight entirely. The ones who wore trousers as a point of pride. Who didn't reject pants for speed or show, but instead embraced them, tailored them, and turned them into a defining mark of knightly evolution. Let's talk about those knights. It starts with the late 14th century, a time when fashion began to converge with function in surprising ways. Hosea were getting tighter, tunics were getting shorter, and suddenly, what had once been the rough brockie of a Saxon farmer were becoming the sleek, elegant legwear of a proper courtly gentleman. In some places, particularly the Burgundian court, trousers weren't just accepted, they were weaponized. Tailors developed joined hose, tightly fitted and sometimes padded to accentuate the calves and thighs. Armorers even began designing leg protection with style in mind, curving greaves to match the fashionable line of a nobleman's leg. Historians still debate whether this shift was driven more by military necessity or vanity, but there's no denying the trend. By the time you reach the mid-15th century, the best-dressed knights in Europe look less like shaggy warlords and more like polished mannequins with swords. And here's the twist. Wearing trousers became a statement of modernity. Knights who clung to the old bare-leg style were now seen as rustic, even outdated. The new wave of aristocratic warriors, part diplomat, part duelist, part dashing heartthrob, preferred to show off their fashion sense along with their swordplay. A 15th century fashion manual from Milan even advises young nobles to present the leg firmly, without fear, for it reveals the strength of the man and the wisdom of his tailor. You wonder how many duels started over bad tailoring. Of course, there were critics. There always were. Conservative voices called the tight hose indecent, ridiculous, or effeminate. But the trend was unstoppable. Art, poetry, and etiquette books began celebrating the clothed leg. Trousers had gone from mere utility to non-status symbol. You lead your horse from the stable, pat its neck, and watch as a young knight adjusts his brand new hose, dark blue, embroidered with silver thread. He catches your eye and grins. "Good fit?" you ask. "Best tailor in Dijon," he replies. "Costs more than my horse." You resist the urge to tell him his horse looks offended. Another knight nearby scoffs. "Used to be a man didn't need embroidery to win respect." The younger one shrugs. "Used to be a man didn't need socks either. Times change." It's hard to argue with that. The stables are alive with the sounds of packing, leather straps being tugged, metal clinking, someone trying to convince a mule that stairs are not, in fact, optional. And amid it all, the pant debate rolls on. But slowly, quietly, you sense the shift. Fewer bare legs now, more hose, more armor carefully strapped over carefully tailored fabrics. Even the veterans who once swore they'd die with wind on their knees are quietly slipping into more modern attire. Because the world is changing. Faster roads, better tailoring, a new generation of knights raised not on fire and mud, but on reputation, presentation, and courtly intrigue. Knighthood is no longer just about brute strength, it's about image. You walk past a mirror-polished shield reflecting the stable torchlight and catch a glimpse of yourself. Tunic, hose, boots. Decent, presentable, surprisingly stylish, given the circumstances. Maybe pants aren't the enemy after all. Maybe they're just another kind of armor. You've seen your fair share of chaos on this journey. Muddy battles, poetic feasts, holy lectures about thigh modesty. But nothing quite prepares you for what you encounter today. A royal tailor's tent. Yes, in the middle of a campaign trail, amid grumbling soldiers and horse dung, someone has erected a striped pavilion filled entirely with bolts of silk, braided trims, and a small fussy man with spectacles and a measuring rope who announces, "I'm here to make you look like you've won, even if you haven't." You've arrived at the newest front in the war on trousers. Tailored propaganda. This is where the knightly image stops being just battlefield practicality or poetic flair and becomes a fully managed, curated brand. You step inside. A knight stands on a crate, arms out, while the tailor and two assistants poke and prod, measuring his thighs like they're mapping out a new duchy. The knight is half amused, half afraid. His old hose lie in a wrinkled heap nearby, looking like they've just surrendered. "What's this for?" you ask. "Portraits," says the tailor, without looking up. "And court processions, and marriage negotiations, and really, just the future in general. Because by the 15th century, knights weren't just warriors, they were public figures. Nobles needed to look the part, especially as wars slowed and diplomacy became the true battlefield. It's hard to convince a king to trust you with a county if your knees are flapping in the breeze. So yes, pants became political. Tailored hose were commissioned for paintings, festivals, weddings, and coronations. Court painters knew exactly how to elongate the leg, emphasize the calves, and drape tunics, just so to imply strength and refinement. The knight's body was no longer just a weapon, it was a canvas. Historians still argue whether this era marked the full domestication of knighthood or simply a shift in priorities, but the evidence is clear. Knights in portraits after 1450 look significantly more covered, groomed, and symmetrical than those in battle roles a century prior. And while pants didn't fully eliminate individual flair, some still wore the shortest tunics they could get away with. The bare leg as identity had mostly vanished. It wasn't just about weather anymore, it was about messaging. You exit the tent as another knight enters, this one asking whether crimson hose make him look too fiery. The tailor deadpans, only if you set them on fire. Across the camp, a bard is sketching armor designs for a songbook. You catch a glimpse. Everyone in full hose, not a naked knee in sight. Fashion catches up to myth faster than history. And you wonder, what happened to the rebels? The knights who wore short tunics in the rain, who refused breeches on principle, who let their thighs tan freely under the indifferent sky. Some of them retired. Some adapted. Some vanished into legend. But not all. You remember a tale from the eastern marches of an older knight, battle-scarred, beard like tangled rope, who refused to attend court even when summoned by the king himself. "They don't want me," he reportedly said. "They want someone who looks good in velvet." He died in a tunic and half-torn hose. And his name, forgotten. Meanwhile, across the realm, portraits of sleekly dressed knights hung in manor halls, passed down as heirlooms. Noble lineages traced not just through land and titles, but through wardrobe. You return to your own tent, unroll your travel cloak, and sit quietly for a moment. You examine your hose, plain, serviceable, a bit too tight around the ankles, and you smile. Because here's the truth. Pants didn't kill chivalry. They just refined it. They turned knights into statesmen, warriors into gentlemen, legends into diplomats. And whether you wore them or not, you were still part of the story. The stars are bright tonight, clear, cold, and sharp enough to prick the skin if you look too long. You sit by a dying fire, boots off, legs stretched toward the embers, and the camp is unusually quiet. No heralds, no minstrels, no poetry about noble knees, just the soft hum of snores and the occasional owl with opinions. You've reached the end of your journey, at least this one. And what a strange road it's been. Through muddy tournaments, smoky feasts, musty tailors' tents, and more exposed thighs than you'd ever hope to witness in this lifetime. You sip the last of your mead and lean back, thinking about what it all means. This odd, winding, centuries-long conversation about pants. Because at first, it seemed like a joke. Why would any knight refuse something as basic as leg coverings? Why charge into battle like a windswept candle? Why risk frostbite, thorns, or catastrophic saddle rash for the sake of tradition? But now, with the story fully unwound, it starts to make sense. It wasn't just about trousers. It was about how knights saw themselves and how they wanted to be seen. In the early medieval days, bare legs meant boldness, simplicity, the raw edge of warrior culture. Trousers were peasant garb, something you wore to dig ditches, not to storm castles. Knights rode high above the fields, clad in linen tunics, iron mail, and the wind itself. As time passed, the meanings shifted. Practicality crept in. So did armor technology. So did cold weather and common sense. Eventually, trousers became not just acceptable, but fashionable, then expected, then required. The knight, once wild and windblown, became polished and posed. He wore hose embroidered with family crests. He commissioned portraits. He danced at court and debated poetry, fully clothed. Historians still debate whether this was progress or performance, whether the soul of knighthood was lost beneath layers of silk and civility. But that's the nature of history. It moves. And pants, somehow, moved with it. Back at the fire, a young squire pokes his head out of a nearby tent. His hose are mismatched, one red, one green. He yawns, waves, and vanishes again into sleep. You smile. Because while some nights followed rules, others bent them, and some, those rare, stubborn few, ignored them entirely. And those, perhaps, are the ones you remember most. The pantless crusaders, the legless rebels, the hose-hating romantics. They weren't always right. They weren't always wise, but they were committed to their vision of honor, to the wind on their thighs, to the clanking, galloping, deeply inconvenient legacy of what it meant to be a knight on one's own terms. And now, that legacy is yours too. You pull your blanket tighter and feel the last warmth of the coals kiss your feet. The fire sighs. The stars blink. Somewhere, a rooster is already confused about the hour. And you? You're content because you've journeyed through a world of chainmail and poetry, leather and linen, rebellion and reputation. And along the way, you've learned that sometimes, just sometimes, the history of trousers is also the history of choice. And now, let your shoulders soften. You've wandered long enough tonight, through muddy camps and candlelit halls, through laughter, lectures, and the quiet rebellion of bare-kneed knights. You've seen fashions rise and fall, armor rust, and myths unfold in the quiet hum of horses and hearth fires. The world of the medieval knight is far behind you now. The clatter of hooves has faded. The torches have gone out. Even the wind, once so insistent on finding every uncovered inch of leg, has stilled. Your breath slows. Your hands relax. You no longer need to follow the story. You've lived inside it, felt its rough textures, heard its strange jokes, imagined its cold stone walls and soft woolen cloaks. Now, all that's left is the slow sinking warmth of stillness. The camp is quiet. The sky above you is velvet, sprinkled with stars too ancient to care about trousers. And you? You're safe. You're still. You're exactly where you need to be. So let go of the armor. Let go of the questions. Let go of the last flicker of firelight in your mind. Sleep comes gently now, like a padded cloak over your shoulders, like a knight finally resting after a long, strange ride. Close your eyes. Breathe deep. Let the story fade. Let the silence win.